Imagine standing at the edge of a cliff in the California mountains, watching a shadow the size of a small aircraft drift silently across the canyon wall. 9.5 feet of wingspan, a creature that soared over these same ridgelines when mammoths still roamed the valley below. And then, for one very dark moment in the 1980s, it was gone. Not just endangered, actually completely, officially extinct in the wild. This is the story of the California Condor. But more than that, it's the story of the stubborn, sleep-deprived, passionately disagreeing human beings who refuse to let it stay that way. The California Condor, 9.5 feet of wingspan, up to 25 pounds, is the largest land bird in North America. It is ancient, bizarre-looking, and against all odds, still alive, because a handful of scientists, rangers, and indigenous community members waged the most dramatic wildlife rescue in American history. This story has everything: bureaucratic warfare, ethical meltdowns, hand puppets, and one very emotional moment involving a bird released back into a sky it hadn't seen in years. Let's start at the worst possible moment. By the early 1980s, the condor was in free fall. Agricultural chemicals, poaching, lead poisoning, and habitat destruction had gutted the population. By 1982, only 22 birds remained in the wild. 22, fewer people than fit in a school bus. For a species that once ranged from Florida to British Columbia, this was catastrophic. The bird had been on the federal endangered species list since 1967. Agencies had studied the problem, identified critical habitat, tried to manage the decline. None of it was working fast enough, and the people tasked with saving the condor were staring down a decision no one in conservation history had faced at this scale. Do you leave the last wild birds in nature where they're dying, or do you cage them? The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the California Fish and Game Commission advocated for something as bold as it was controversial: capture every last condor and commit to breeding them in captivity. The scientific community absolutely lost its mind. On one side, researchers argued captive breeding was the only mathematical path to survival. On the other, prominent biologists and conservation organizations believed pulling every bird from the sky was tantamount to surrender, that you'd be saving the species while destroying everything that made it wild. The argument wasn't just scientific, it was philosophical. What does it mean to save a species if you have to strip it of its wildness to do it? That question had no clean answer. It still doesn't. But the numbers didn't care about philosophy. By 1985, only 9 wild birds remained. On April 19, 1987, the last free-flying condor was netted, crated, and driven away. The California condor was officially extinct in the wild. 27 individuals, the entire species, headed to the Los Angeles Zoo and the San Diego Wild Animal Park. 27. You could fit every last California condor on Earth into a single room. The weight of knowing that if this program failed, it was game over sat on a small group of biologists who were essentially making it up as they went. Now they had to figure out how to make condors actually breed in captivity. The condor was not going to make this easy. They can't reproduce until age 6, and a mated pair normally produces only 1 egg every year or 2. That's a reproductive timeline that makes pandas look prolific. So the team got creative. Eggs were removed as they were laid, causing females to lay a second and sometimes a third egg. The extra eggs were incubated, and the chicks were raised by caretakers using a hand puppet shaped like a condor head. A puppet worn by a human being so that babies would imprint on condors instead of people. Picture someone with a PhD hunched over a baby condor, wiggling a foam puppet, making sure this bird doesn't think it's a person. That is dedication. That is also, objectively, one of the strangest jobs ever conceived. Here's a question for you. If you were one of those biologists in 1987, faced with only 27 birds left on Earth, would you have supported pulling them all from the wild? Or would you have fought to leave some free, even knowing the risks? Comment your thoughts below. Back to the comeback, because it actually worked. In 1988, a condor pair produced the first chick ever hatched in captivity at the San Diego Wild Animal Park. One tiny, ugly, magnificent chick, proof that the whole audacious scheme might work. Then came the moment everyone had been building toward. In 1992, the first captive-reared condors were released into the Los Padres National Forest. Biologists who had spent years staring at these birds through zoo glass watched them lift into open sky. A bird that shouldn't exist anymore was riding a thermal over a California hillside. But the wild is not a zoo, and the threats that had nearly wiped out the condor hadn't gone anywhere. Lead poisoning from spent ammunition remains the single greatest threat. Condors feed on animals shot by hunters and left on the landscape. That's their ancient biological role, nature's sanitation crew, and that instinct was killing them. Ingested lead absorbs into the blood, disrupts eating, causes anemia, and can make the kidneys and heart fail. Field teams intercept sick birds every year, rush them to zoos for treatment, and release them again. It is an endless, exhausting, expensive loop. And now one of the most powerful threads in this story, one that doesn't get nearly enough attention. For the indigenous peoples of California, the condor was never just a bird. For tribes like the Chumash, Esselen, and Yurok, the condor, called Pregonish by the Yurok, is a sacred being with important spiritual roles, featured in creation stories, ceremonies, and traditional ecological knowledge. Its feathers and songs are foundational to Yurok world renewal ceremonies. The bird's absence didn't just disrupt local ecosystems, it left a spiritual void. The Yurok tribe launched its Condor Restoration Program in 2008 and released its first birds onto tribal lands in 2022, establishing a release facility in Redwood National Park based on their sovereign right to restore their ancestral ecosystem and cultural practices. Tiana Williams-Clausen grew up on the coast near the mouth of the Klamath, went to Harvard for biochemical sciences, and came home in 2007 because condor restoration was the work her people needed her to do. She has spent years handling condors, building partnerships with government agencies, and listening to what Yurok elders have to say about the great bird. That's what this recovery looks like on the ground, not just data and transmitters. A woman who went to Harvard and came home because her people needed her to bring back a sacred bird. Just recently, something extraordinary happened. For the first time in more than 100 years, California condors are nesting in the Pacific Northwest, on Yurok tribe territory in Northern California. It is one of the most significant moments in condor recovery since the 1980s, and a profound act of ecological and cultural restoration for a people who consider the condor a sacred relative. But the story doesn't end with clean hands. As of 2024, there are 343 free-flying California condors, with an additional 217 in captivity. From 27 birds in a zoo to more than 500 total, a miracle by any measure. Yet the threats haven't disappeared. Despite full legal protection, condors are still being shot. AC-9's daughter, Condor 526, was illegally killed in 2018, the daughter of the very last wild bird ever captured, killed by a bullet. Lead poisoning still accounts for around half of all mortalities. The breeding program cost more than $40 million by the 2010s. Critics called it a waste. Supporters called it the price of a conscience. Here's what you can't argue with. The condor is alive. The sky over the Grand Canyon has condors in it again. Children growing up on Yurok land are learning the word pray-go-niche and watching those great black shapes spiral overhead the way their great-grandparents did. That happened because people, scientists who fought bitterly with each other, rangers who spent years in remote terrain, indigenous community members who held this bird sacred for thousands of years, refused to accept the easier answer. They didn't agree on everything. They didn't always like each other, but they kept showing up. The California Condor story is not really about a bird. It's about what happens when human beings decide something is worth saving and then spend decades proving they meant it. The biologist in the zoo at 2 a.m. with a foam puppet. The Yurok elder watching the first bird lift off tribal land in a century. The field team driving 3 hours into the backcountry to check a transmitter signal, hoping the number that comes back is still a living bird. If this story moved you, hit subscribe. We cover the people behind the planet's most unlikely comebacks, and there are more stories just like this one waiting for you. Drop a comment telling us which part hit hardest, and share this with someone who needs to know the condor is still out there, riding the thermals, impossibly alive.